Now let's turn straight away to our Sun Cabinet's very own Dr. Bhasha Mukherjee. Now, you've heard from our readers. Let's hear from the NHS experts. What did you think of Wes's interview there?
You sounded really passionate, and I'm really looking forward to what you're going to do for the NHS. I love the word reform because I think most people are very scared of change, and I'm definitely not. I think the NHS 100% needs change. But how are you going to achieve it in 5 years if you do get the chance?
Yes, I don't think we can achieve everything in 5 years, but I think we can make a good start, and I think we can get performance standards like waiting times in A&E or response time for ambulances much closer, if not achieving the performance standards they should do after one term of Labour government. But I think what we're asking the country for really is a mandate for a decade of reform and modernisation. And in order to get permission for 2 terms, we need to make sure we deliver everything in the first. And that's why, although Labour sometimes gets criticism, like, are you promising enough? Are you going to be spending enough? I'd much rather come back in 4 or 5 years' time and have a conversation with you that says, you know what, we delivered our promises and we're able to do a bit more, than come back in 4 or 5 years' time and say, do you know what, we got a bit carried away, we're a bit too ambitious, and therefore I've got to explain to you why I broke the promises to you and to patients. So that's the balance we've tried to strike.
And I completely see that you, as a politician and someone who's had a positive experience with the NHS, are wanting to change the NHS, but ultimately you as a politician are not connected in any way to the health sector at all. So how do people, the public and the health sector, how can we trust someone who's completely disconnected with the actual health services, never spent a day in a ward, not had to face the criticism from patients, from social media, the censorship that we get, from GMC and all the rest of it? You don't know what it's like to be in the front lines. Why should we trust someone like you to make the decisions for where we work?
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm a patients champion, and patients are also an important voice in the system. But where I'd absolutely agree with you is that if we're going to get the NHS to from where it is today, worst crisis in its history, to where we want it to be, ultimately that's not going to be driven by one politician sat behind one desk in Whitehall. It's got to be driven by the whole NHS team working together. And what we have to do in government is to make sure that we give you the tools to do the job, resources, sure, but also pushing as much power towards the front line as possible, making sure that where you've got clinicians coming up with brilliant ideas to improve patient care, that we've got your back, and also that we spread that. Because, any single one of Labour's policies on the NHS isn't something that I've cooked up. What I've done is look at best practice in the NHS, and the problem is it's outstanding practice, the exceptional practice. We've got to take the best of the NHS to the rest of the NHS, and that's the sort of the thrust of Labour's reform agenda.
Wes, isn't there a problem there, though? You talk a good game, ministers talk a good game, you're pro-reform. There is a very vocal pro-reform part of the NHS, but there's also a very, very large part of the NHS that doesn't want to reform. It wants to keep on just going hand to mouth, essentially, because that's what they want to do. How are you going to convince a wider section of the NHS that your message is the right one?
Well, 2 things. One is I recognise that a lot of people are scarred by experience, and sometimes when I use the word reform, they instantly think top-down reorganisation, because that's what they remember. That was their last big reform, and they felt victims of it and devastated by it rather than empowered by it. So I've got to make an argument that says, look, this isn't top-down reorganisation. This is about the change, the modernisation that you as NHS staff are crying out for, and crucially patients are crying out for, because we're all in it for patients. And the other thing I'd say is, we shouldn't mistake the howls of online outrage as being representative of the NHS workforce.
It's unions as well, though, isn't it?
And I do think sometimes there is a kind of default that says if we just had more money, everything would be better. And it's sometimes the job of politicians to trade in uncomfortable truths and to say, look, if we just go on as we are, we're not going to have the NHS as it is today in 10, 20, 30 years' time. We can't go on with managed decline. And what gives me hope, though, is that I see on the front line the sorts of reforms, the sorts of changes that we want to deliver. They are proving what's possible and actually giving not just the rest of the NHS, but our country the hope and possibility that change is possible. Because at the moment, I don't think Labour's biggest opponent in the election is the Conservative Party. I think it's cynicism and people worrying about whether anyone can fix it.
Who's the face of that cynicism?
In terms of, I just think that millions of faces of that cynicism. I knock on doors all the time and talk to voters who will say,
cynicism in the public rather than within the NHS.
Oh, in terms of whether anyone can turn this around, yeah, I think that's where the public are at the moment. I think they can see the country's in a desperate state, but they are also absolutely done with politics and politicians, and that's a bad place for a country to be, because I genuinely think that we can't reform the NHS without the front line, without the staff, without the organisation pulling together. But we also can't do that without good politics. And so Labour's got to try in the next, if we win the next general election, we've got to rebuild our public services, rebuild our economy, and rebuild trust in politics.
We've got the big picture. Dr. Pasha's got some very detailed questions about how you're actually going to do it. Everything from out-of-hours appointment, non-dom strikes.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I mean, all I'm hearing is that, reform because what was done was wrong or bad. But we have just had the worst pandemic and so much has gone on. What would you have done differently, if at all? Because it's very easy to point the blame and point the finger at someone who's actually doing the job. And that sort of scrutiny is faced upon us as well, and we're doing the job. So, I mean, the Tories have been managing the country however they have been. What would you have been done differently?
So I think on the pandemic, we tried to work really constructively with the government because it was a national crisis. I do think there are lessons to be learned, but actually that wouldn't be where I'd focus my criticism on the last 14 years. And I would accept that if there'd been a Labour government, things would have been difficult. So that's not where I'd lay my criticism. Where I would lay my criticism was on that disastrous top-down reorganisation. And that actually, when you compare the NHS to health systems in other OECD countries, other advanced economies, we don't do nearly enough in primary care, community services, or general practice, community services, social care, mental health. And so part of Labour's reform agenda is to shift the centre of gravity of the NHS out of hospital into the community, making sure the NHS isn't just a national health service, but a neighbourhood health service. Because, because people can't get to see you as a GP, there are thousands fewer GPs, people are waiting far too long, they end up in A&E. And that's worse for them, but also more expensive for the taxpayer, because seeing a GP would cost about 40 quid, ending up in A&E costs 400. So you've got to constantly look at the system, how it's changing, how it's evolving, and modernise.
And despite that, GPs only get 8% of the budget. Will the Labour government finally change that and put more money off the NHS pie, so to speak, into the
Yes, I've been following what you've been saying, and I think you're right that as a percentage of the NHS's budget, we've got to grow primary care and general practice. Now, that'll be hopefully good news and music to the ears of GPs who I think want to spend more time with their patients, but there's reform as well. We measure you by about 40 different measurements in terms of the way in which we judge GPs. We've got to cut through some of that red tape so that you can spend more time in what we would call the family-doctor relationship, you would call continuity of care. The evidence tells us that's better for patients, but also it's what doctors enjoy doing and it's what patients value too. So that's the reform part.
The other elephant in the room, though, is the strikes. How would you possibly have dealt with it any differently without getting out a checkbook, which, by your own words, doesn't exist and Rachel Reeves won't let you?
Well, I think there's a few things. One is that I think the government were far too slow in recognising the risk to the NHS as a result of industrial action. We had this mad situation, do you remember? But when the nurses were threatening to go on strike, at the 11th hour, the Royal College of Nursing, which had never been on strike in its history, said to the government, look, if you just sit around the table with this, we'll postpone the strikes, we'll suspend the action. And the government said, no, we're not doing that. And they went off on strike. And once they went on strike, it was hard to get them back.
Yeah.
And then because they didn't have a strategy for pay overall, we've ended up in this, I think, pretty unconscionable position where consultants have had a better pay deal than nurses. Now, and I say this with respect to consultants, not least one of them saved my life a few years ago, and these are brilliant people. Consultants would understand when I say that I would not lie awake at night worrying about whether a consultant can pay their bills. But I do know plenty of nurses, plenty of porters, plenty of junior doctors who are struggling to pay the rent, who are struggling to pay the bills, and NHS hospitals are setting up food banks for their staff. That can't be right in 21st century.
We're out of time with Dr. Pasha. One more question for the man that wants to lead the health service.
Yeah,
one quick one.
Ultimately, you're talking about reforming the NHS, you're talking about reforming GP and primary care, but to do that, you have to retain the staff, and junior doctors definitely create the foundation of it. And we're still at the same position that we were at. Is there something, even if it's not monetary, is there some sort of advantage that we would have as junior doctors going forward that Labour can do?
What I'd say is we can't deliver 35% overnight. The route back to fair pay has got to be a journey, not an event, but I do recognise the case that junior doctors are making. And I also recognise that beyond pay, there are a whole number of other conditions in terms of the lack of respect for junior doctors, the way in which placements are undertaken. I think just the disrespect to the junior doctor cohort that we need to look at. And I want to work with junior doctors, and I just ask them to give me that time that we'll need.
The junior
as well.
doctors' unions are slightly misrepresenting the views of the wider junior doctors. They seem to be much more militant.
Look, I think the BMA Junior Doctors Committee are definitely taking a hard line. You look at the percentage of people turning out in those ballots and the size of the mandate. I think what they are reflecting is a well of anger amongst junior doctors, and we've got to work with them because this is the future of the profession. It's not going to be easy.
If we believe the polls, it's going to be your problem in a number of months. Thank you for coming to see us.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry you upset so many people with your article on Monday, but we
No,
enjoyed
look,
it.
there are going to be harder fights to have, and ultimately, unless we deliver the medicine it needs, the NHS isn't going to be there for us. And I appeal to Sun readers to give change a chance and give Labour a mandate at the election.
Dr. B, thank you. Wes, thank you. Readers, thank you for brilliant questions.